And we've more adventure on horseback tomorrow when Yul Brynner leads a group of professional gunmen called in to protect a Mexican village from marauding bandits. The Magnificent Seven saddle up at 7 tomorrow evening.
Drama for Christmas on BBC One features Silas Marner, an adaptation of George Eliot's classic novel that stars Ben Kingsley as the lonely weaver who suffers at the hands of fate. He is rewarded by a gift no less precious than life itself.
It's a lone thing and I'm a lone thing. My money's gone and this has come. It's come to me.
Silas Marner is at 10:10 tonight on BBC One.
And before that, in a quarter of an hour, there's a soft shoe shuffle at the Ministry as Whitehall and Westminster embark on a game of musical chairs in Yes, Minister. But now it's time for the news on BBC One with Francis Coverdale. It's 5 to 9.
Northern Ireland, the government sends 600 more troops to bolster security. Winnie Mandela is arrested again.
Don't push me!
The soccer hooligan jailed for 3 years in Belgium. And the man from the underground who's going places in the world of opera. Good evening. The government is sending more troops to Northern Ireland. Another regular army battalion, about 600 men from the Royal Anglian Regiment, will leave in 3 days. They're going at the joint request of the General Officer commanding troops in the north and the Chief Constable of the Royal Ulster Constabulary. It's understood their duties will include safeguarding the rebuilding of police stations damaged by the IRA in border areas.
6 police stations have borne the brunt of the IRA's new gun and bomb campaign this month alone. 2 policemen have died and more than a dozen people have been injured. After consultations between the RUC's Chief Constable and the General Officer commanding troops in the province, it's been decided to boost the army presence here by a battalion. 9,000 soldiers are presently serving in Northern Ireland. From Thursday, almost 600 soldiers of the Royal Anglian Regiment will leave Colchester to join them. But the strengthening of the army operation has been described by one politician as the most startling contradiction of the Anglo-Irish agreement.
It now looks as if the Prime Minister has suddenly discovered that the advice given to her by her army and RUC advisors was correct after all, and that particularly in the light of the recent campaign of the mortar attacks on RUC stations, she's got to defend the frontier of the United Kingdom, and of course we welcome that.
In view of the IRA's threat to kill any contractors brought in to carry out repairs to police stations, it's expected the extra troops will, apart from normal operations, be deployed to safeguard any construction work.
The Northern Ireland Secretary Tom King has predictably dismissed the suggestion that sending more troops to the province is evidence the new Anglo-Irish agreement isn't working. Mr King's been meeting today with the Irish Foreign Minister Peter Barry. It was their second get-together since the agreement was signed. Security will certainly have been discussed. Extra policemen from the Republic are understood to have been drafted into the border area over the Christmas period. And Mr Barry is known to have been concerned about the latest hunger strikers in Northern Ireland. An early date for an appeal on their behalf is likely to have been discussed. But there was agreement that the hunger strike was wrong and wasteful. Nobody, though, would be forced to eat against their will. Both governments insist it was a routine meeting, but that very routine is what outrages much unionist opinion in Northern Ireland.
The directors of Westland Helicopters have decided they will send shareholders details of the European bid to save the company. Until now, they'd openly favoured the deal backed by the American Sikorsky Company. But today's decision by the Westland Board didn't go far enough for supporters of the Defence Secretary Michael Heseltine. They'd been hoping for an outright recommendation in favour of the European offer, which they think would be better for Westland shareholders.
Westland's directors haven't wavered in their view that Sikorsky is the better bet.
They'd rather stay with their trusted private sector ally than take their chance with state-owned European firms, vulnerable, they say, to political interference. But Westland's board is determined to show that the European option is being given a fair and considered hearing. All sides agree that the European bid does offer shareholders a superior deal, if only marginally. It should also mean more immediate orders for Westland's Yeovil factory, including Sea King helicopters for the Ministry of Defence. Now shareholders will be able to choose. The European consortium won't be displeased. The door is now open for their bid to be considered by the Westland shareholders. That's a considerable advance, as up to now the Westland board had been recommending a link with the Americans. Mr. Heseltine's supporters have been growing in optimism, and after today, he's well back in the hunt. The European bid may not be ready to be put to the Westland shareholders meeting in 2 weeks' time, but the delay means that they'll have 2 bids, not just one, to vote on.
Winnie Mandela, wife of the jailed African National Congress leader Nelson Mandela, has been arrested by South African security police for the 2nd time in 8 days. Mrs. Mandela had just flown back to from Johannesburg after visiting her husband in prison over Christmas. She was defying an order banning her from the area, including her home in the black township of Soweto.
Winnie Mandela had stayed out of trouble as long as she was visiting her husband Nelson in prison in Cape Town. But she said all along she was determined to defy her banning order again and arrived with her grandson at Jan Smuts Airport outside Johannesburg, intent on doing so as publicly as possible. Mrs. Mandela regards herself as an irresistible force, the government as an immovable object.
I can only explain that I am doing what any normal human being does. I'm going home.
Mrs. Mandela left the airport pursued by a convoy of security police and press.